Mr. Speaker, last week in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, we marked up Chairman Michael McCaul's bill, Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity, REPO, for Ukrainians Act. At its core, the REPO Act utilizes Russian sovereign assets to pay for the Ukrainian current financing gap or its long-term reconstruction, or both. It seems brutally obvious to everyone that Russia should be responsible for the cost of the damages stemming from its illegal invasion of Ukraine, not American taxpayers. It's particularly offensive to the global community that a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council would blatantly and viciously destroy all aspects of the global order, invade a sovereign neighbor unprovoked, repeatedly commit war crimes, and violate too many international treaties to be named here. The REPO for Ukrainians Act would give the President authority to seize, transfer, and vest Russian sovereign assets within U.S. jurisdiction into an international fund for the sole purpose of Ukraine's eventual reconstruction. Considering most Russian sovereign assets are located outside the United States, it's important for our partners and allies around the world to introduce and pass companion legislation. Here, the United States may not act effectively unilaterally. Recently, I met with Europe's rapporteur, Luzem Basha. He fully understands the urgency of global action and action to be taken in Europe. And there's bipartisan recognition here in the Congress that the United States must be a global leader on this topic and through coordination with the G7 and our allies. This bill is consistent with well-established international precedent where the United States worked with international partners to establish a fund like we saw with Afghanistan in 2022, or the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal in 1981, or the UN Compensation Fund for Kuwait in 1991 following the invasion of Iraq. According to legal experts like Professor Lawrence Tribe, Russian objections based on claims of sovereign immunity are baseless, as using Russian assets to rebuild Ukraine helps restore the principles of national sovereignty. Russia cannot violate Ukraine's sovereignty while invoking its own as a shield. Concerns that seizing Russian assets will undermine the U.S. dollar are also unsubstantiated. By working with our European colleagues, we will show that the seizure of assets is not a risk to doing business in dollars, but rather is an international condemnation for unprovoked aggression by Russia. In my view, the REPO Act, as marked up in committee, still has some room for improvement, such as declaring that Russia's illegal war first began in February 2014 after its initial invasion of Crimea. But with that said, I want to thank Chairman McCaul and acknowledge several points from my text, the Ukraine Reconstruction Act, that were included in the Chairman's revised REPO bill. First, we made sure to hold Belarus accountable for its direct role in supporting Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. Next, we added controls to ensure good governance and standards around the International Ukraine Compensation Fund, and its mechanism includes audits by independent auditors and the Government Accountability Office. Chairman McCaul also accepted that the bill should clarify important concepts like judicial review and the definition of seizure to mean the confiscation of all rights, title, and interest in the sovereign asset. Now let me turn to some examples about how this legislation would work in conjunctions with our allies and partners around the world. First and foremost, it's generally accepted that the Russian central bank assets held outside of Russia are the first order of business. Public estimates of this funding are approximately $200 billion, mostly held in Europe, principally in Brussels. Europeans have considered the use of interest on these assets as an immediate way to gain benefit for the funding of Ukraine's war effort or covering a portion of their monthly budget. Thus, there are both short-term and long-term potential uses for the corpus of $200 billion in central bank assets held abroad or using the earnings on that total amount. Additionally, I argue that state-owned enterprise assets outside the Russian Federation should also be considered as Russian sovereign assets as well. Mr. Speaker, nearly 40% of the Russian Federation's economy is owned by state-controlled companies. Russian public companies that are wholly owned by the Russian sovereign state, like being over 51% of their public shares, should be considered fair game for building assets necessary to rebuild Ukraine. For example, Gazprom, the largest oil and gas enterprise in Russia, is majority owned by the Russian Federation. It has lots of operations outside Russia. Likewise, one of Russia's most prominent commercial banks is controlled 51% of shares by the Russian Federation. That's Sberbank. By including state-owned enterprise assets, this increases the leverage and negotiating authority of pressing Russia for change to bring about this war to an end and utilize these assets for funding reconstruction. With that, I look forward to consideration of the REPO for Ukrainians Act by the House soon. I want to thank Mr. McCall for working with me on making this a stronger bill, and I hope that the senators, Senator Risch and White House legislation, can also be considered in the Senate.